In 1988, an entire classroom full of students vanished without a trace. It was a disappearance that stunned the nation, and for nearly 40 years, it remained an unsolved mystery. Parents, teachers, and investigators were left bewildered, with no clue about what had happened to these children or their teacher. The town was gripped by fear, confusion, and sorrow as the missing were never found, until, nearly 4 decades later, a woman came forward, claiming she had been part of the class that disappeared. Her name was Sophie Ryder, and she had promised to reveal the chilling story of what happened to her and her classmates on that fateful day. Sophie's sudden appearance reignited the mystery as she broke her silence and stepped into the light. What she revealed, however, was more shocking than anyone could have anticipated. The day of the disappearance was an ordinary Tuesday in April of 1988. Mr. Hamilton, their teacher, had decided to take his students out of the classroom for a geography lesson in the nearby woods. He believed in hands-on learning, saying that true knowledge came from experiencing the world firsthand. The day was bright and filled with the promise of spring, with the blooming flora and fauna providing the perfect backdrop for their lesson. But what Mr. Hamilton didn't know was that this decision would lead to a disaster of unimaginable proportions. The children were excited to leave the confines of the school, running through the woods and enjoying the fresh air. They were never too far from the school grounds, and Principal Clarkson had approved the outing, confident that Mr. Hamilton's methods were sound. Everything seemed perfectly fine. But then, when the school bell rang at 3 o'clock and no one had returned, panic set in. The principal waited for a few minutes, assuming that perhaps the class had lost track of time. However, when the clock continued to tick and there was still no sign of them, he became alarmed. Principal Clarkson was the first to call the police. He hesitated, not wanting to assume the worst. But instinct told him that something was very wrong. Better to be safe than sorry, he thought. After providing the officers with the details of where Mr. Hamilton had likely taken the children, 2 officers were dispatched to the area. But as time passed and there was still no sign of them, the search grew more intense. Parents, teachers, and more officers joined in, combing through the woods with flashlights in hand. "They can't have just vanished," one distraught mother whispered to herself as she waved her flashlight around desperately, the beam cutting through the dusk that was quickly falling over the town. A full platoon of men, complete with search dogs, marched through the woods as the hours turned into the deep night. Everyone was on edge, and a feeling of dread settled over the town. The barking of the dogs offered a momentary glimmer of hope, especially when they found a girl's ribbon caught in a branch. But still, no trace of the children or Mr. Hamilton was found. Weeks passed, and slowly, the hope of finding them alive faded. It was as if they had simply been erased from the face of the earth. Symbolic funerals were held for the children, even though no bodies were ever recovered. That ribbon was the only reminder of the tragedy, a haunting token of a life left unfinished. As the years went by, strange tales began to emerge from the town. People claimed that on nights when the moon was full, they could hear the faint cries of children in the woods. Stories of ghosts, lost souls, and supernatural events circulated, but none of them led to any answers. Families moved away, unable to bear the weight of their grief. The once thriving community became a shadow of its former self. It wasn't until nearly 35 years later that everything changed. One day, Sophie Ryder returned. She was unrecognizable to the townspeople, having aged significantly. She was now in her 40s, her face weathered by the passage of time. She walked through the streets of her hometown, her steps slow and hesitant. The town had changed. Buildings she once knew were gone, replaced by modern structures. The roads were busier, and strange cars zoomed past her, unlike anything she had seen before. As she made her way toward the police station, Sophie couldn't help but notice the odd look she was getting from the people she passed. She paid them little mind, but her ragged clothes, which had seemed perfectly fine in her memories, looked strange in this modern world. "Ma'am?" Sophie called out to a passerby, her voice uncertain but firm. The woman stopped, surprised by the sudden address. "Yes?" she answered cautiously. "Can you tell me where the police station is?" Sophie asked. Her voice carried a gravity that the woman noticed immediately. Following the directions, Sophie walked through the unfamiliar streets until she reached the police station, the new landscape serving as a stark reminder of how much time had slipped away. The police station, once a familiar structure in her mind, was now a sleek, modern building that intimidated her. Steeling herself, she entered, her heart pounding as she approached the front desk. Inside, the bustling atmosphere came to an abrupt halt as soon as she stepped in. Officers and civilians alike turned to look at her, their conversations pausing as they took in the sight of her outdated clothing and disheveled appearance. The world had changed, but Sophie had not. She stood out like a figure from another time, an anachronism in a world that had moved on without her. She cleared her throat, trying to push past the stares. "I'm Sophie Ryder," she began, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "I'm one of the children who went missing in 1988. The room fell silent. Whispers filled the air as officers exchanged skeptical glances. A few of them began to murmur amongst themselves, clearly questioning her mental state. Was this some sort of hoax? They couldn't believe what they were hearing, but Sophie stood firm, her voice steady as she began recounting the events of that fateful day. The officers were reluctant to believe her at first, scribbling notes with a mixture of doubt and intrigue. It wasn't every day that someone walked in claiming to be from a classroom that had disappeared decades ago. As Sophie continued her story, describing the moments leading up to their disappearance, the tension in the room grew palpable. The skepticism hung heavy in the air, and the officers whispered among themselves, unsure of how to proceed. It was at that moment that the police commissioner, intrigued by the commotion, decided to step in. His authoritative presence immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the room. The officers straightened up, falling silent as he approached Sophie. The commissioner listened carefully, his sharp eyes narrowing as Sophie held up something small in her hand. It was the ribbon, frayed and faded, but unmistakable. He recognized it instantly. It was the very same ribbon that had been found all those years ago, during the initial search. The room fell even quieter, the skepticism giving way to a growing sense of possibility. This was the first solid piece of evidence they had seen in decades. He took the ribbon from Sophie's hand, examining it closely. The initials, stitched neatly into the fabric, were a direct match to those found during the search in 1988. The commissioner's expression softened, his earlier doubt beginning to melt away. He invited Sophie into his office for a private conversation, eager to hear more about what had happened to her and the others. Inside the commissioner's office, Sophie sat down, feeling a sense of relief as he opened an old case file from a dusty cabinet. The weight of the past seemed to fill the room as the commissioner began to recall his time as a young officer working on the case. He had been there during the initial search, and he remembered vividly how the discovery of that ribbon had haunted him for years. It had been the only clue they had ever found. Sophie took a deep breath and began to tell her story. She explained how, on that day, the class had been enjoying their time in the woods when something unexpected happened. A bear had appeared, catching them by surprise. What had started as a joyful outing quickly turned to panic. Mr. Hamilton, thinking quickly, led them to a nearby cave to seek shelter from the bear. They had thought they were safe, but as soon as they entered the cave, there was a sudden collapse. Rocks tumbled down, trapping them inside. The collapse had sealed them underground, cutting off any chance of escape. The air filled with dust, and in the chaos, Mr. Hamilton was injured. They were trapped, with no way out and no idea if anyone would find them. Days turned into weeks, and the reality of their situation began to sink in. They found remnants of an old mining operation inside the cave, which had provided them with some basic tools and supplies, but it wasn't enough. Over time, they learned how to survive in the darkness, using whatever they could find. Water trickled down from the cave walls, and they foraged for edible plants, including mushrooms that grew in the damp environment. But it was a bleak existence, and they were constantly plagued by the fear that no one would ever find them. As Sophie spoke, the commissioner listened intently, his expression growing more somber with each passing detail. The story was almost too incredible to believe, yet every word she spoke rang with truth. The other survivors had managed to hold on, living in the darkness for years, but not all of them had made it. Some had succumbed to illness, while others had given up hope entirely. When Sophie finally finished her story, the room fell into a heavy silence. The commissioner sat back in his chair, staring at the ribbon that still lay on his desk. It was a reminder of the innocence that had been lost, and the harrowing ordeal that had followed. He knew that Sophie's story was just the beginning, and that there was much more to uncover. But for now, they had their first clue. After decades of mystery, the truth had finally begun to emerge. Sophie left the police station that day feeling a sense of closure, but also knowing that there were still unanswered questions. The other survivors were out there somewhere, and the story of what had happened to them was far from over. For the town, however, it was a moment of both relief and sorrow. The mystery of 1988 was finally beginning to unravel, but the weight of what had happened still lingered heavily in the air. The woods, once a place of childhood joy and innocence, had become a haunting reminder of a past that could never be forgotten. And as Sophie walked away, the ribbon still clutched tightly in her hand, she knew that her story, and the stories of the others, would live on forever. The town would never be the same, but at least now they could begin to heal.